best way in term limits? How will this eliminate corruption in our government if the Constitution is already not adhered to?
Well, let me handle the last part of that question, and you can handle the first part. I hear this a lot too. Well, nobody pays attention to the Constitution anyway. Well, first off, yeah, they do. Has it been changed over time? Yes, it has, over 200 and some odd years. But 2 points. Number one, if you look at the amendments to the Constitution, and I would ask, which of the 27 amendments that have been passed since the founding, which has been fundamentally ignored? Was the election, popular election of senators ignored? No, we popular elect senators. Was the women's right to vote ignored? No, women have the right to vote. Was temperance, was prohibition ignored? Well, no, there was a lot of trouble, but they repealed it. Was the repeal ignored? No. I mean, you can just go on down the list. Was the abolition of slavery? No, that wasn't ignored. Now, we had problems in certain areas of the country, but the country accepted these amendments because why? Because 38 states, or 3/4 of the states, ratified it. There was a national consensus. That's what the founders believed in. They believed we needed to get a national consensus to change our fundamental law. And that once you had a national consensus, then the country would accept it and move on. And that has happened in every case. Now, I'm not saying if you go back to the First Amendment and say, wow, we've eroded some of the things of the First Amendment. Yeah, but that's over 250 years, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, I'll take that. I'll take 250 years of an amendment holding up pretty well, right? So I'm not saying that if we passed whatever amendment that took the government out of education, that there wouldn't be fights and everything, but you know, for a long period of time, they would hold to that. Why? Because no politician in their right mind or no court is going to stand up and say something that was a national consensus that got Democrat and Republican states to pass, that somehow or other they're just going to fly in the face. This is not going to happen. You know, one of the things I found, and I know this is going to be strange for you, there's not a whole lot of political courage in Washington, D.C. There really isn't. It's not like they go out and try to rub your noses, right? They don't go out and try to offend you. They don't go out and do things that don't have some popular support. Now you say, well, look, some of the things they do don't have popular support. Well, not here, but they do in New York City, and they do in Chicago, and they do in the districts that they come from. You don't see too many heroes in New York City stand up and oppose gun control. Why? Because everybody in their district's for it. So you say, well, they do things that don't agree with you, but again, they do things that are consistent with where their constituents are. And that's the point, is that there are very few brave people who stand up and say, this is right, I don't care what my constituents say, I believe this is right, and we're going to do that. If a thing passes with 38 votes, no one's going to stand up for any long period of time and fight that.
Yeah, and then the first part of the question is, why is this the best way to get term limits in a balanced budget amendment? And the answer is, or get the budget balanced, nobody's going to balance the budget without this. And they're not going to balance the budget because it's against human nature. If you believe that you have an infinite pile of other people's money to spend, you're not going to stop spending that money. And that's really what they believe. That's the way they look at it. It's not your money, by the way. It's their money. And it doesn't belong to you. It belongs to them. And they believe it's a bottomless pit. They don't see the consequences to continue the spending. And by the way, stopping the spending is not going to be easy. This is really important to understand. About 70% of it are now entitlement programs. And reforming those things and slowing or cutting the spending is going to be very painful. And a lot of it's not going to be very popular either. Everybody wants to cut spending unless it's the spending that benefits them, right? And so there's a constituent for every dollar spent by the federal government. So those spending cuts are difficult. And so we actually are doing the politicians a favor by imposing some form of balanced budget amendment on them, because then they can say to their constituents, look, I don't have a choice. This is what the Constitution says. We have to balance the budget. I don't like doing it. It's very difficult, but we've got to make some difficult decisions. So that's the only way we're going to get them to balance the budget. And term limits, well, do you think they're going to limit their own terms? I mean, we know they're never going to do that. It's funny, I had this conversation with Ted Cruz not long ago. Bless his heart, he's proposing a term limit amendment in Congress. Do you think they're going to vote for that? No. They're never going to limit their own terms. So the only way we're going to get these things is if we impose these things on them.
Okay, do you have any drafts of the amendment that would be discussed at the Convention of States?
No, we don't have draft amendments, and there's a specific reason for that. I mean, first of all, it's important to understand that what we have is what's called a subject matter application. In other words, neither Rick nor I is proposing a specific amendment. As I said, there's 3 subject matter areas, and the convention itself is meant to be a deliberative body. They're supposed to go in and have debates and have discussions about what the right kind of amendments are. That's the process and how it was designed to work. But there's also a strategic reason for this. See, we studied the entire history of the Article 5 movement in America, and states have been bringing Article 5 applications since the very beginning of the country. There have been over 400 applications. We've never reached the requisite 2/3 of states because the applications haven't done what's called aggregating, meaning they're not the same. You need 34 states or 2/3 of states at any given time to agree on what they're going to come together and talk about, and that hasn't happened. One of the reasons it hasn't happened is in a lot of cases, there were very specific amendment proposals. And what happens when you lay out a specific amendment proposal, let's say everybody in the room raises their hand and say, we're all in favor of a balanced budget amendment, and I say, okay, here's the amendment that I think we should do as a balanced budget amendment. I guarantee you, and especially because we're conservatives, at least half the room is going to say, well, that's not how it should work. That's crazy. That's the wrong balanced budget amendment. You missed this, you missed that. It'd be better if we calculated debt versus GDP like this. And there's going to be some great ideas in the room. We're going to have a big argument about, do we have the right balanced budget amendment? And then what that means is we're going to argue about that, and we're never going to make it to convention. And that's the history of the Article 5 movement. So by doing a subject matter convention, these are things, these 3 areas that the public widely agrees upon. We poll this regularly. I can tell you 75% of Republicans in the United States of America, when they know what an Article 5 convention is and know what the 3 areas are in support of it, 66% of independents say they're in support of it, 52% of Democrats say they're in support of it. So we've got to get to convention, and that's when we'll have the debates on specific amendments.
But if you don't have anything as a draft, I think, why don't you put, you said that the wall is against the Constitution, well, amend it. I bet you it would get ratified. The biggest expense is what, we've got 5 million illegals, not vetted, not anything. We're having to lodge them and pay meals. That is a lot of the budget. Build a wall, put that on your draft. It should be a discussion at least.
It should be a discussion at least, and people can discuss that kind of thing at convention. But again, our draft isn't dealing with specific issues. It's subject matter area. And you should actually like that. And you're throwing up your hands, and I'm going to push back really hard. Because what you're saying is you want something very specific. If I put up something very specific right now, it will be attacked. And I promise you, based on 200 and almost 50 years of history, and I've got all the history on my side, and no offense, but you don't, it won't make it to convention.
You mentioned that the medical cost is way up high. We are having to provide medical care
Absolutely.
to every illegal that comes in here.
So if we prohibit the federal government from being involved in medical care and the health insurance industry and the health industry in America, then that would prevent them. And then states could do whatever they want. And so again, that can be discussed. But the problem is what you're discussing with me, and I appreciate it and I agree with everything you're saying, but you're discussing what are your most important issues, your pet issues. And what we want to make sure is we have a convention where everybody like you can bring up their ideas and we can debate that in a national debate and decide what the American people want.
The Constitution.
We'd ask everybody to save their questions for after or for the cards. We do have a question about the cards. We'll get to that. But how close is Idaho from joining the Convention of States? And is it up to our legislators to vote for Idaho to join the Convention of States?
I mean, to say how close, I don't know how to measure that. But here's what I can tell you. I've been coming to Idaho for I'm going to say 7 years now for Convention of States. So I got a thick skin, and I'm going to come back no matter what happens every single year until we get it done. I can tell you walking into the legislature this year has been an entirely different experience than I've ever had in Idaho before. I can tell you that the support is widespread. You guys had a really strong turnover in your legislature, which I think is always healthy. And we talk about term limits, but you guys did the term limits here. You turned a lot of people out of the legislature. You had a lot of retirements. There's a lot of new blood in the legislature in both houses. And we had by far the warmest reception that we've ever had in the Idaho legislature since I've been doing this. And yeah, it's up to your legislature to make that decision. And so it's legislative leadership, it's committee leaders, it's new members, it's senior members. I can't even count the number of people you and I met with, but it was very positive all the way through.
Okay, this, all right,
I just encourage you to meet with your members. I say this all the time, having been a member of Congress for 16 years, just remember, your legislators are people too. And like any other person, when you meet someone, they want to be treated as you do with respect. And so I just encourage you to be respectful. I encourage you to be kind. If they say no or they're undecided, be kind and try to make your point. One of the things I just encourage is personal contact. Go to their town hall meetings, go and meet into their offices. Let them know, that your representative and your senator from your district knows that you care about this and that it's something that is important to you. And you don't have to be loud, you don't have to be mean, you don't have to provide information. Say you're willing to talk. If you're comfortable about talking about it, point to reference places for them. But the more they can hear from you, and the more it's personal. And what legislators don't like is they don't like getting form letters and sort of all these form emails and things like that. That just doesn't have the impact, particularly because it's so easy to do that these days, is to send form emails to people or form texts. So personal contact is everything. So I would just say this to you, for those of you who have come either supported it before you came here or now think it's a good idea. I turn it back to you. I mean, you say, well, we'll have them do their job by passing the Convention of the States. I turn it to you. You do your job. You need to do your job of letting them know that this is important to you. You need to do your job as a citizen to be an activist to make this happen. And you're lucky. You're in a state that's not a big state. Your legislative districts are not big. You have outsized impact on your state house member and state senator. I come from a state where my state senator has 350,000 people in their legislative district, right? So it's not your impact. The impact to a state senate district in Pennsylvania is not big as an individual. Yours is. So take the power you have. It's the beauty of coming from a smaller state. Individuals have much more power in states like this than they do in the Californias and Pennsylvanias and Floridas. So don't pass up the opportunity to make a difference for your country.
Your next question is about the format. Why are we not allowed in this event to personally ask our questions? Normally in a town hall setting, the constitutional patriots are allowed to ask questions, their own questions.
The principal reason is that people don't know the difference between a question and a statement. People are here we're here to answer questions. We're not here to listen to speeches from people who want to come here and give speeches. And I know that, I know some people have come here and they want to give their speech and they want to be able to be heard, but the folks that we advertise this accurately, which is this was a town hall meeting to receive questions and provide answers to the questions that we're receiving. So I think we've gone through a bunch of questions. We'll go through all the questions we can. I'm happy to stay as long as anybody's willing to sit out here and answer questions. But we didn't say this was a debate. We didn't say this was a public speaking opportunity. We said this was an opportunity to ask questions and get answers to those questions.
Okay, our next question. Montana voted against the Convention of States. Do we know why and any of their concerns?
Yeah, I don't know what the final analysis is. The Montana State Senate actually was 25-25. That's the best vote we've gotten out of Montana in a long time. We made a lot of progress there. I know they were thinking, do you know whether they did a reconsideration or?
That's still being discussed.
Yeah, so there's a possibility today or tomorrow for them to do a reconsideration and re-vote it. In the earlier vote, this was the final passage. In the reading before passage, it actually passed 26-24, and someone flipped their vote to make it 25-25. So just tells you, I mean, this is, in Wyoming today, it passed on first reading 18-12 in the state senate. So, these are states, as I keep saying, I don't know why they're close. I don't know why they're close out here in the freedom-loving upper Midwest here and the Rocky Mountain West, but it is. And we're fighting not Democrats by and large, but we're fighting folks, as I said before, who don't trust you, don't trust the people to rise to the occasion and help save this country. They trust Washington. That's the bottom line. They do. They trust Washington to continue to do what they're doing, but somehow or another to change course. And I don't understand how people out here in this area of the country can look to Washington, D.C. and say, we trust you more than we trust ourselves. But people do. And we have to accept that, and we're going to keep coming back out here and keep working it.
You both talked a little bit about the state legislature, legislators receiving you. Do you believe a resolution will be introduced this year in Idaho?
Yes, we do. And we're hopeful at this point we're working in both legislative bodies. We spent more time in the Senate, so I don't know, maybe the Senate will be first. We're not really sure about that yet, but we're working through the process, and I just encourage all of you to talk to both House and Senate members, and particularly the House has a lot of new members, and so I always say, new members are sort of new soil to be plowed. A lot of them are not familiar with it. They haven't been in the legislature before. They're not that familiar with the issues. So it's really important to, if you have a new member who's in your district, to make the time to speak with them.
Why not repeal the 17th Amendment?
I'm all for it. Anybody think we can take the people's right to elect their senator away from them and that would pass in 38 states? Raise your hand. Look, there's a lot of great ideas out there that I'd like to see done, and repealing the 17th Amendment would be one of them. I just, I live in the real world, and I don't think Americans are going to give up the right to elect their senators. I could be wrong. I'm happy to be proven wrong, but I don't think it's going to happen. And so if we're pretty sure that's not going to happen. I don't know if that's ever been polled, but I guarantee if it was polled, it wouldn't be very high. But we have ideas that have polled and are very high that actually could blunt some of the effects of the 17th Amendment's passage. And so, if you can't go through the front door, then you find some other way to accomplish the purpose. And that's what we're trying to do.
What would be the time duration for a convention of states, and who appoints the delegates?
Well, the time duration is uncertain. It would be a convention. Remember, these are elected officials, by and large, who are going to be at the convention. So they're probably, in all likelihood, it will be done in the summer months when most legislatures are out of session. My guess is it would be 2-3 months would be the time, maybe a little bit longer than that. But it would be a defined period of time to debate and consider a variety of different amendments. As I said before, the commissioners are appointed by the legislature. And again, where you would have the most impact on how they're appointed, what their commissions would be, what the limitations on their ability to cast votes in favor of certain subjects, all of that can be included in their commission. So again, it's an opportunity for you to influence your legislature as to what type of commissioners, who and what they're going to do when they're there. You have an impact on that.
Can the Senate shoot down the convention?
Well, yeah, there's no guarantee that it's going to pass. And so we need to get a majority. It's just a simple majority, both in the House and Senate. Both houses have to pass it in the same legislative session.
All right, our final couple of questions here. Let me see.
I'm sure you got some repeats there.
Yes, Senator. Do you see this turning around America apart from wide sweeping violence? If so, how?
Yeah, one of the things I say, because, you know, I talk to a lot of folks, and I had one person tell me that they aren't going to support this because we're way past the convention. You know, the only thing left is violence. That's what I had a legislator tell me. And not here in this state, but in another state. And so there are people who believe that. I don't. I believe our founders gave us the way to solve this problem. And shame on us if we aren't willing to use every single measure. You know, people talk very cavalierly about violence. Why don't you just go over to Ukraine and see how great violence is? See how great not having power is. See how great having your neighbor's house blown up with them in it. See how great that is. It's not great. It's not something we should even contemplate unless we're absolutely forced to it. And the idea that we won't use what's in the Constitution to control the problems that all of you are concerned about who are predicting violence, shame on us. Shame on us. That we wouldn't use a peaceful resolution that has the possibility of restoring our freedoms before we went to something as radical as violence.
And just a final thought, a closing statement from both of you.
You know, obviously there are people on both sides of the issue in the room, and I want to close with one of my favorite stories from an early American president. John Quincy Adams was the president of the United States. Everybody knows that. What most people don't know about Quincy Adams is that after he served as the United States president, he went back to the legislature and he was elected to Congress, which to me is actually, in today's world, unimaginable, right? So I mean, you're the big man, and now you go and you're a backbencher in Congress because you've got no seniority. And he goes to Congress, and the reason he goes to Congress is because he is a just staunch abolitionist. It's all he wants to talk about when he's in Congress. In fact, he ends up getting the nickname the Hellhound of Abolition. And he's annoying because he doesn't want to talk about anything else. He's not interested in any other legislation. He's not cooperating with anybody else. His colleagues in Congress are so annoyed by him, they actually passed something called the John Quincy Adams Censure Rule. And that rule actually says that if he speaks about abolition on the floor of the United States House of Representatives, that they will hold a censure trial, 5-day censure trial. And he makes the decision to speak about abolition because that means he gets 5 more days to talk about abolition. So he's not an easy guy to get along with. The press doesn't like him because he never says anything interesting because all he wants to do is talk about abolition. And it is a time in our country's history when there's not going to be abolition. He just doesn't have the support. He doesn't have colleagues in Congress that are for it, but he continues to do it on and on and on. And one day he's approached by a reporter in Congress, and the reporter basically says to him, Mr. Adams, why do you keep doing this? You're wasting your time. You're annoying your colleagues. You're annoying us. Why do you keep over and over talking about abolition? And he says something which I think resonates so true to our times, and it's so important. He says, duty is ours, and the results belong to God. Duty is ours, and the results belong to God. That was a man who knew what his duty was. And it didn't matter to him at all whether he ever accomplished abolition because he knew he was doing what he was called to do by God, which is to fight to right a wrong, regardless of the outcome. John Quincy Adams died without seeing abolition. 17 years in the United States House of Representatives. He actually fell on the floor. He had a stroke in the House. If you go to Congress today, you can see a statuary hall that used to be part of the House of Representatives with a little plaque on the floor. It says this is where he fell. This is where he had his stroke. I actually took him to what I think is now the women's cloakroom, and that's where he passed away. You know, in his last time in Congress, and in his last term, he met a young congressman, and this young congressman was so enamored that he was serving in Congress with the great John Quincy Adams that he began to follow him around. And he befriended him, and he was mentored by him, and he just wanted to learn everything that John Quincy Adams had to teach. John Quincy Adams had his three-part plan for abolition, and this young congressman learned the plan and followed him around. And after Adams died, it was such a great honor. They become such good friends that this young congressman, this first-term congressman, was asked to be one of the pallbearers at his funeral. Really extraordinary honor, right? A presidential funeral and a first-term congressman as a pallbearer. And after that congressman's term is over, he wanted to run again, but back then there was a lot of control by the local parties, and the party told him, no, you can come on home. It's time for you to come home. We're going to send somebody else to Congress. And he went home. Later on, he ran for office again, and he was defeated. He ran a second time. He was defeated again. He ran a third time. And you know who he is, and you know him as the great emancipator, Abraham Lincoln. And I think that's such an important story, such an incredible story, because Quincy Adams did his duty as he saw his duty before God, and because of that, the great emancipator brought us abolition. In his lifetime, he never saw it, but because he did his duty. So today, I would encourage those of you who are in the fight to save the country, whether you're for Convention of States or against Convention of States, to remember the concept of duty in the way that the great founders of this country and the framers of our Constitution did, and do your duty regardless of the outcome. Thanks for that.
Yeah, I don't know if I can add to that. That's pretty strong, Mark. But the message is the right message. You know, the last question was, is the Senate going to defeat this, or are we going to lose? Yeah, who cares? I mean, I want to win. I'm not here to lose, but I'm here to do what I can do, right? I'm here to fight the fight and do whatever I can do. And one of the things I learned in my life, like Mark was just saying, is that if you do what you're called to do, if you do your duty, and you are faithful, what I have learned is that God will be faithful. And I can give you story after story. One story that I can share, that when I was debating a bill back in the late 1990s, some of you have heard of the partial birth abortion bill. Well, I was the author of that bill, and I was the lead sponsor, and I was fighting that battle on the floor of the United States Senate, and it was the first time we were trying to override President Clinton's veto of that bill. And we did very well. I mean, President Clinton had never had a veto overridden, and we had a very narrow majority in the Senate. The House had overridden it, but the Senate needed to do the same. And we even got some Democrat votes that we knew we were going to get, who came out in favor of overriding the veto. And this is an abortion measure. Think about that. But we came into the final day of debate, 2 votes short. And we debated all day. I debated 6 hours against Barbara Boxer. I don't know if you know Barbara Boxer. I always say, I'm Catholic, and I always say I'm going to get time off in purgatory for Barbara Boxer for 6 hours. And so I finished the debate. We were done. It was about 8 o'clock at night. We were about to wrap up. We had what's called our closing script before we adjourned for the evening. And I was sitting there waiting for them to finish the final touches on the script. And I just had this feeling come over me that I needed to do more, that I needed to say more. And so I went up to the guy in the chair. There was just the 2 of us in the chamber. Everybody else had left. No reporters, no anybody. And so I went up to the guy in the chair who was a senator from Ohio, who's now the governor of Ohio, Mike DeWine. And I went up to Mike and said, Mike, I've been sitting there and I'm feeling like there's some things that I need to say. And I said, I'll just be a few minutes. And he said, sure, take whatever time you need. And I said, okay, so I ran back in the cloakroom. It was 8 o'clock at night, and I called my wife. At the time, we had 4 children. We had just had 3 children. And I'll never forget, my Colin, and our youngest was just a year old and crying in the background. It was late at night for them, 8 o'clock. We were trying to get them to bed. And I'm saying, honey, I said, I know I said I'd be home, but I just feel like I need to say something else. And as my wife would always say, she said, if that's what you feel called to do, you go out there and do it, we'll be fine. And so I went back out there and I started talking. And about an hour and a half later, don't worry, I'm almost done. About an hour and a half later, I finished. And I sat there and I talked about what just impacted me, that Dianne Feinstein and Barbara Boxer and all these other, Ted Kennedy, getting up there and saying that we had to keep this procedure legal late in pregnancy because women might find out that the baby they were expecting isn't what they wanted anymore. Because the baby may have had cleft palate or some other deformity, and that we needed to kill these children because these mothers didn't want these babies anymore. And so I remember putting up poster after poster. This debate happened. I got letters and communications from all over the country, in fact, all over the world. People sending me and telling me their stories about how the medical community wouldn't give their babies care because they were disabled. Or they were forced to have an abortion because their baby was disabled. Or they couldn't find a place to have a baby because the doctors were afraid of the liability of delivering a child with a disability. And so I'm telling their story after story after story, and I just got wrapped up in it, didn't realize what was going on, and so it finished, and I thought, well, maybe there's a couple of senators who were sitting there at night and don't have a life and are watching C-SPAN, or watching me on C-SPAN. You never know. And so I remember, saying prayers and saying, God, this is, please have this used for a higher thing and just, make this happen. So I get home, it's 11 o'clock at night or whatever it is, all the kids are asleep, Karen's asleep. I get up the next morning, 5:30 in the morning, that was my schedule, took off before everybody was up. Went in there, all excited we were going to win this thing, we lost by 2 votes. Didn't change a vote. I'll never forget sitting there just completely depressed. And I walked outside the chamber and walked out to the steps. And when you walk out the center steps, you look straight across and there's the Supreme Court building. I remember looking at that building and saying, and just feeling a sense of not just defeat, but I was angry with myself that I thought who am I to think that I was going to make a difference? What a fool I was. Here's another night where I didn't tuck my kids into bed at night. Here's another night where I was a lousy husband and didn't lay with my wife that night. Here I am just saying, what a fool I was. And 2 days later I got an email. It was from a young man from Michigan State University. And the email read as follows. My girlfriend and I were sitting on the couch flipping through the channels one night on the other 2 nights ago. And we saw you standing on the floor of the Senate with a picture of a child with a disability next to you. And so we stopped and we started listening. And you told the story about the horrible procedure of partial birth abortion, how you were trying to override the veto, and the story of this little boy. And he said, I looked down at my girlfriend who was laying on my lap, and I saw tears running down her cheek. And I said to her, what's wrong? And she said, I'm pregnant. And I have an abortion scheduled for tomorrow. But I'm not going to have an abortion anymore. That little girl, against all the odds, because the mother of the girl and father of the girl disowned her, left her, said they wouldn't support her, but she went ahead and had that little girl. And I found out that if you are faithful, God will be faithful. And so all I just say to you is, don't worry about what the result is. I know we can get wrapped up into this world and think that what we think is best for the country is what God thinks is best for the country. But sometimes you got to lose to win. And sometimes you have to accept the fact that God's plan is better than yours. And so pray for His will, and remember, You have no idea what you do if you do it for the right reason, if you do it for good, if you do it because it's God's calling you to do this. You have no idea what's going to happen. As I always tell people, if you lose, you just didn't get the email. Imagine had I not got that email.
Yeah.
Trust me, there are emails out there for every one of you who pursue God's will. And we just need to do that here. Pray and keep doing the right thing and keep doing your duty. God bless you.
Thank you, Doc. Thank you, Senator. Appreciate it.